Welcome to another class of Principles of Organismal Biology. Today we're going to continue learning about plants, and in particular, we're going to learn about seed plants. Seed plants are conformed by both gymnosperms and angiosperms, meaning that these two lineages have seeds. They produce seeds. What's a seed? I'm sure that you have eaten tons of seeds, but what's the definition of seed? Can you think of one? We're going to go through that today. We're going to understand the different groups or learn the different groups that plants have that contain seeds or produce seeds. And as I said, they are divided mainly in gymnosperms and angiosperms. What are gymnosperms? Today we're going to focus on gymnosperms. In the next class, we're going to cover angiosperms. So for today's class, we're going to go through the major groups of gymnosperms. We're going to review what's heterospory and understand that gymnosperms have heterospory. And we're going to go through the time cycle. Okay. So remember, these are the four main lineages that we can find in plants, and some of them are actually artificial groups. They are bryophytes, right here, with the dominant gametophyte. And then we have here the seedless vascular plants. That means that they evolved to have xylem and phloem. They are vascular plants, but they lack seeds. They don't have seeds. So examples of that can be ferns. And then in here, all of the seed plants are going to obviously produce seeds, and they are split in gymnosperms and angiosperms. They are also vascular plants. That's important to realize. Whereas in bryophytes, the gametophyte is the dominant. In the life cycles of all of the vascular plants, including the seedless vascular plants and seed plants, all of them have dominant sporophytes. And the gametophyte in ferns is very small. We say that it could be around the size of my nail. But in angiosperms, for example, the megagametophyte can be 8 cells, so it's microscopic. So they also get very microscopic in males, in the microgametophyte. This is the phylogeny that we are presenting associated to plants. And remember, the plants belong to the subgroup Archaeoplastida, along with green algae and red algae. And in here we have these non-vascular plants called bryophytes. We have explained that they are a paraphyletic group. And then we have the seedless vascular plants, which is another paraphyletic group that includes lycophytes and monilophytes, or pterophytes, as divided here in your book. And then seed plants contains gymnosperms and angiosperms. This is a monophyletic group. So they have the ancestor right here. And in this group of seed plants, the ancestor is included with all of the descendants, right? Gymnosperms and angiosperms, that means the seed plants, they split around 300 million years ago. So this is an ancient split in the evolution. And as I was saying, angiosperms and gymnosperms are going to have seeds. But what's a seed? You are familiar with all of these types of seeds, I hope. So we have black beans over here. We have lentils. We have other type of seeds like garbanzo seeds, chickpeas, I think you call them. And there are other type of seeds that we don't eat, like fireweed seeds. We don't eat. And they have, some of them, they also have appendages that might facilitate dispersion. In this case, these appendages help the seeds to disperse by wind. But what's a seed? So the properties of a seed is that they have an embryo. This is the embryo. And just think about what you will do. If you want to preserve life, right? You want to put a tiny individual, that's what an embryo is a baby individual, with food, lots of food, very nutritious food, surrounding it. that's exactly what we have in the seed. And here we have the embryo, and these are baby leaves. Actually, they are called cotyledons. And in here, this tissue, this food supply in gymnosperms, that's actually the gametophyte, the female gametophyte. So it's very small. In some points, it is a little bit larger, but in some, it's very, very small. Okay, so we have the embryo, we have the food supply, and then what's going to be very important is the seed coat. And the seed coat is going to be providing protection. So you can think about protection of things eating it, like fungi or bacteria, things like that, but also environmental factors. So biotic factors, as I mentioned before, but abiotic factors such as desiccation, right, or higher temperatures. So this seed has this protection around it. And that protection comes from a structure in the ovules. In the ovules, we're going to have this structure called integuments that later develops into this seed coat. It becomes harder as it develops. Okay, so now I want to show you this cone. So we have a cone right here, and this cone has ovules. Remember that a cone is a structure that is going to have multiple sporophylls, and in this case, as it is a female cone, is going to have multiple megasporophylls, and you can see all of these megasporophylls right here. And each of these megasporophylls is going to have two ovules. In this figure, you can only see one depicted, one ovule per sporophyll. And in here, as I mentioned, you have this integument, right? And the integument is diploid, because that's maternal tissue. Then we are going to have the megasporangium right here, which is also diploid. It's coming from the mom tree. And then we have a megaspore result from the meiosis with a wall, a spore wall, right? We learned that that's important in the colonization of Earth. Okay, so we have the megaspore. Now that's haploid. So this ovule is ready to be fertilized. And pines, if you have not noticed, they release a lot of pollen during the pollination period. And then wind disperses the pollen. And the pollen is actually quite funny. Some people call it the Mickey Mouse pollen, because it looks like it has two big ears, but they actually function as air sacs and help floating or help with dispersion of the pollen. So the pollen then is deposited directly to the ovule, directly. So these ovules produce a pollination drop. So it's a lot of water with sugar and other components in this drop. And then the pollen lands there, and when it's ready, then the drop gets absorbed and the pollen gets moved closer to this area for the pollen grain to fertilize as one of these cells, but it happens later. So this is an unfertilized ovule. Just for you to see some comparisons of these megastrobilite, here we have a baby female cone, and this is something that I did during my PhD, and I have a cross-section here for you. So these are the ovules, actually, these guys right here, and each of these structures is the megasporophyll. What happens? Where is the pollen being produced? Well, we have this male cone, right, the microstrobili, or just male cone. And in here, we also have these sporophylls, but remember, if it's male, then we call it microsporophylls. And they are going to be the ones producing the pollen. And you can see a lot of tiny dots in here. All of these are pollen grains that they get dispersed. Then what is really interesting in pines is that they release the pollen. The pollen gets, it lands in this pollination drop. You cannot see it here, but that's how it happens. And then fertilization actually happens later. And when I say later, it means a lot later, like the next year. So fertilization is going to happen, it's going to occur several months later. And in here you have the male gametophyte, or the pollen, and it's going to germinate, and it's going to carry one of these spermatic cells. That's the gamete, and the male gamete. And that gamete is going to be fused with one of these cells. It is called the egg nucleus. I mean, it's called the egg, but it's going to fuse the nucleus. Then the result of fertilization is going to be an embryo, which is diploid. And this food supply, as I mentioned before, is part of this female gametophyte. So this female gametophyte is going to remain haploid, and the food source, it's going to be haploid still. This is going to be very different in gymnosperms. So please remember that, because that's going to be handy later on for you to understand some of these differences. And as I mentioned briefly before, these integuments, this one in the ovule right here, becomes really hard and thicken, and that's what is covering the whole seed. Okay, so this is a seed, and you can see the seed coat that is really thick, right? It's really thick. This is a cone, this is a pine cone that it's mature and is ready to disperse the seeds. So it opens, right? It's all open. And now we have one seed here that hopefully you can see this structure. This structure is a wing attached to the seed that helps with wind dispersal, right? So this wing. Okay. Another thing to notice in this cone is that obviously this is mature, but imagine just a baby little cone when fertilization is occurring. And what happens is that the pollen will come, and as I was saying, it will be placed directly or closer to the ovules. And the ovules are going to be at the base of these structures right here. This is the seed. This is another seed that doesn't have this wing, and it's dispersed by some rodents or some corvids, like blue jays. And the same type of the seed that I mentioned before, this one, it's one of the ones that we studied in my lab. And when we germinate it for an experiment, this is how the plants look. So these are the leaves of the pine, and this is Pinus monophylla or monophylla. What is the adaptive significance of seeds? Well, it protects the embryo, it provides nutrition to the embryo, and it helps with dispersal. As I was explaining before, depending on the structures, the seed can be dispersed by wind or by other vectors, like biotic vectors, such as animals. So water can also disperse the seeds. And they have this dormant mechanism. So what that means is that they're going to be sleepy, right? The embryo and all of the seed has lowered its metabolism, and the seed can remain dormant for years until it senses the right conditions to germinate. That means maybe the right amount of light, the right amount of temperature, and water, right? Those are the main factors that determine the dormancy, to break the dormancy for these seeds. Now, let's talk about the different groups that are in seed plants. Gymnosperm is one of the phyla or divisions in seed plants. The other one is angiosperms, but we're going to cover it next class. In gymnosperms, we have 4 different phyla or different divisions. One is Cicadophyta, then Ginkgophyta, Cteniophyta, and Coniferophyta. This is an example of Cicadophyta. It's Cicas revoluta. And these guys have a male cone that looks like that. The females look very different. Maybe you have seen them. They form very large red seeds at the base, and they have a very interesting pollination in which these cycas, it's very hot and attracts some of the pollinators, like beetles, by this thermogenesis. It's very important that you notice that they look like palms, but they are not palms. Palms are actually angiosperms. So that's what we call convergent evolution. The leaves look a lot similar, but they are very, very different. And if you look, dissect them and look closely, you will find differences. So yes, this is one example of Cicadophyta. Now we have these compound leaves, and we are going to have the male cone right here. The other phyla or division is Ginkgophyta, and in that case, we only have one species. In Cicadophyta, I just mentioned one species, but we have actually several genera in Cicadophyta and also several species. Whereas in Ginkgophyta, we only have one genus and one species in that genus. So it's the only species that we have on Earth in this division or phylum, Ginkgophyta or Ginkgophyta. Ginkgo biloba or biloba is dioecious species, and that means that it's going to have male trees and it's going to have female trees. Right? So trees that only produce pollen and trees that only produce ovules. That's our definition of dioecious. Dioecy, or this dioecious system, it's present in humans. So it's probably easy for you to think about that. So we have women and men, so with the sexes separated. Dioecious comes from the Greek di and oikos, meaning two houses. And the way that you have to think about it is that the sexes are separated into houses. Whereas in other plants, we're going to have the sexes in the same plant in different type of arrangements. And that has some consequences, evolutionary consequences that we're going to be discussing later. But let's go back to Ginkgo. This is then dioecious species that produces male and female trees. The female trees produce these type of fleshy seeds that are very stinky. And they have this pomade type of, or fan-like leaf. So this is very distinctive of Ginkgo biloba. And this is an issue of planting females. Sometimes in some cities is prohibited just because it's very, very stinky. The third group in gymnosperms is Gnettophyta. In this group, we're going to have three different genera. One is Gnetum, the second is Ephedra, and the last one is Welwitschia. This is Welwitschia, which grows in Namibia in Africa. And it's very, very interesting because if you see all of the desert around here, you would expect to see this massive plant in the middle of the desert with these gigantic leaves that can be like this large, you know, a couple of meters. So this is what happens in Welwitschia, and it creates a microhabitat for different species, including lichens that grow on top of this plant. So this genus, it's kind of estimated to be or have evolved at least 200 million years ago. And here we have the ovulated cones of this species, Welwitschia. And we also have some male structures, but it's not visible in this picture. Another genus is Gnetum. And Gnetum, it's present in North America. And the third genus, it's Ephedra. Ephedra has several species, and that's one of the ones that Native American have used. So Ephedra, members of this genus are commonly named Mormon tea plants. And they produce ephedrine, and it has been used to produce pseudoephedrine, and that's an enhancer that some people use in some medicine and against cold and other properties. But Native Americans use them, especially when they have to walk long distances. They cut some pieces and chew it. The fourth group is Coniferophyta, or conifers, and probably you are familiar with some of these: pine, cypress, spruce, hemlock, fir, redwood, and obviously our beautiful giant sequoias. This is one of them, or a picture showing the beautiful giant sequoias in the Sequoia Park Conservancy. They can be very, very tall, and they have massive structures in their stems. They are adapted to fires, and so they can resprout from after fires that are mild. So this is a picture showing how tall they can be. Another abundant conifer that we have in North America is Douglas fir, European larch, showing these contrast in colors, obviously from Europe. In California, we have Juniperus californica. It's shorter and more adapted to drought conditions. These are the type of female cones that you find in junipers. Another example, very relevant because of our location, is Pinus torreyana. Pinus have around 110 or more species reported alive. And Pinus torreyana is one that has very narrow distribution. It's present in torrey pines, and it's only, it's very restricted, but also the density of the population is very small. Only around 100 individuals are alive currently. We can also find Pinus torreyana variety insularis in Santa Rosa Island, which hopefully you are developing this thinking of how come this pine reached this area? How long ago? How did it get there? But also, could it be that this pine had a wider distribution in the past, and these are just relics? So all of those are interesting questions that have or are being investigated in this pine. One very sad event that is happening right now is that as these pines are getting more drought susceptible, or as temperatures keep increasing, they are more prone to diseases. And these diseases can be beetles. So they have bark beetles currently attacking them. So if you go to torrey pines, you can see some of these experiments that some biologists are doing to monitor this infestation of the bark beetles. Other example of the Coniferophyta is this family Taxaceae. And one species of this family is Taxus bebrifolia. And this species of Taxus bebrifolia, well, it distributes in all of these part of the West Coast, from California all the way to Canada, and also more inland, as you can see in here. So this Pacific or Western yew, mountain mahogany, is also very important or interesting from the medical perspective, because this plant produces a chemical called Taxol. And this Taxol has been shown to have anti-cancerous properties. This molecule has been the target of very interesting research in the battle against cancer. Now, I just want to mention that all of these species, and especially in California, we are a hotspot of biodiversity. What that means is that we have a lot of species in here, but it's not only about the number, but the uniqueness, meaning that some of these species happen or live just in this area in California or in Baja California, in this floristic province of California, in nowhere else. However, we are impacting a lot this province. And one of the things that is happening right now that we sadly are experiencing are all of the fires. And some of these species are adapted to light fires and superficial fires. But the problem that we are having right now is that these very intense and frequent fires are really affecting the vegetation in California. Okay, let's test your knowledge now about these three different structures. So these are three different type of leaves. Select the figure having pine leaves, A, B, or C. And just for you as a hint, all of these plants are tracheophytes. And that means that they are going to have this vascular system with xylem and phloem. And all of these structures that you see in here are the dominant sporophyte, or part of the dominant sporophyte. Okay, the right answer is B. So pines are going to have these type of leaves that I was mentioning before, like in here. This one is part of the fern with the sori that we have covered in the past. And this one is one leaf of an angiosperm, and in particular a rose. So the pine leaves are also called needles, and they are going to have this kind of needle shape of the leaf, and some of them can be very long, like this long, or very short, like that. So those are a distinctive feature of pines is the presence of needles, as you can see in this figure. Now, these gymnosperms have heterospory. You remember what that means? It means that they have two types of spores, right? So for example, we are going to have male spores or microspores and female spores or megaspores. And in the case of ferns, we explained that in the sorus, we're going to have this sporangium or multiple sporangia, and they will produce one type of spores. Right? It's just one type, like in here. In this diagram, in the life cycle, you can see only one type. In conifers, this is one cross-section of, it's the same cross-sections that I show regarding my research. In here we have a male cone and a female cone. And in these structures, we're going to have the formation, or in the ovule, we're going to have one cell that goes through meiosis. That's going to be the megaspore mother cell, goes through meiosis and forms spores, megaspores. And the same thing is going to happen in the male cone or microstrobili. We're going to have one cell that is going to go through meiosis and form spores, which are haploid. So we have two types of spores in these two different structures in here, in this particular case. Okay, let's put all of this information together in this beautiful life cycle. This is the life cycle of a conifer. And let's start right here. So we have a tree that it grows. Some of these trees reach maturity after 20 years, some others even more, 40 years or older. They produce these male cones, and they have these microsporangia. And in this microsporangium one, right, the singular, it's gonna go, one cell is gonna undergo meiosis and result in these pollen grains. In other parts of the tree, we're gonna have the ovulate cone. And this cone, it's gonna be carrying the ovules. And also in these ovules, one cell in one ovule is gonna undergo meiosis and result in this haploid structure that it's gonna be the megaspore later on. So you see how the pink, and the pink, remember, it's the diploid stage. It goes further in the female part compared to the male part, which this cycle happens fast. The part of the the production of the microspores happens a lot faster and is asynchronous with regard of the formation of the megaspore. So microspores and megaspores don't get formed synchronously in pines or in conifers. Okay, now the pollen grain, once that is released, is going to be dispersed by this wind. It's going to be carried close and directly to the ovule. And see how I emphasize that it happens directly. It's deposited directly, because that's going to be the difference between gymnosperms and angiosperms. This, and we're going to cover that in full detail next class. Now, this pollen grain, now, it's going to carry several cells, and these cells are haploid. This pollen now, it's going to remain there in the ovule in a standby. Now, the megaspores, you see how 3 of them die and 1 survives. This megaspore now it's going to produce the archegonium. But the whole thing, the result of mitotic divisions of this megaspore is what is going to form the gametophyte. So what's the ploidy of the gametophyte? It's haploid, right? Mm-hmm. It's haploid. All gametophytes are going to be haploid. Now, this archegonium has multiple cells, and one of them is going to differentiate into the egg. And now, once that's done, from this period to this period, in some pines, it takes 1 year, but in others, even takes 2 years or more. So it's a very long and slow life cycle that conifers have. And we'll see that that's also a different strategy compared to most angiosperms, which angiosperms try to complete the life cycle, a lot of them in a year or a few years. But these guys take their time. And then once that this egg is available, the pollen tube is going to be expanding. So the pollen tube started forming earlier, but it didn't provide, fertilization cannot occur because the egg is not ready. So once that the egg is ready, the fertilization occurs, and we will have, as a result, a beautiful embryo, a baby embryo that is now diploid. This embryo will have the food reserves or food supply that is the part of the gametophyte, which is haploid. And we are going to have also the seed coat. And the seed coat, remember, it's diploid because that's the part of the integuments that just became really, really hard as development occur. This seed can have some appendages to disperse by wind, just like this case. In this case, then we will have the seedling that germinates, and just like this one, the seedlings will grow. This is, I think, is more than a year now. So it will take several years for a baby conifer to reach this large size of some of the species that we have around. Some of these pines can be even 2,000 years, like the individual, or even 5,000 years. Some of the very long-lived pine species, like Pinus longeva, can live 5,000 years. Now, what's a difference between bryophytes and gymnosperms, or ferns and gymnosperms? One of the very important things to remember is that fertilization doesn't require water. In comparison, in bryophytes, and I think in most seedless vascular plants, we need water for the sperm to swim, this flagellated sperm. In conifers now, we don't have that requirement. If you think about it, then this strategy, this adaptation, help conifers to colonize areas that are more arid, that they don't require that much water for reproduction. And the other thing that I want to emphasize is related to the gametophyte. If you remember in bryophytes, the sporophyte was dependent on the gametophyte. And that's something that changed in seedless vascular plants. In seedless vascular plants, we have a gametophyte that is independent of the sporophyte, or a sporophyte that is independent of the gametophyte. So they can live totally independently. However, in conifers, the gametophyte is dependent on the sporophyte. So these three groups have slightly different strategies on how the gametophyte or the sporophyte relies on the other multicellular organism. What plants have dominant sporophytes? A, bryophytes, B, seedless vascular plants, C, seed plants, D, 2 answers are correct, E, 3 answers are correct. Okay, 2 answers are correct because seed plants and seedless vascular plants have dominant sporophytes. And this is to exemplify that. In ferns, we have the dominant sporophyte. These large plants with these compound leaves are the sporophyte, and the gametophyte can live independently, or the sporophyte can live independently. And the sporophyte, it lives longer before it's the dominant phase. And that's different of what happens in bryophytes, in which the gametophyte is the dominant, and the sporophyte only lives if the gametophyte lives. Right? In here, the gametophyte will produce this sporophyte, and then it will die, and the sporophyte will live happily. And in seed plants, we are going to have this dominant sporophyte as well. In conifers, we have these trees, for example, and in angiosperms, these flowering plants will produce the flowers. This is part of the sporophyte. Those structures are the dominant sporophyte. And the gametophyte, well, is haploid. And I said all of these gametophytes, these in bryophytes, these in ferns, and you cannot see the gametophyte in here because they are microscopic. And the gametophyte is going to depend on the sporophyte. In other words, we cannot have gametophytes living on their own in gymnosperms, and the same happens for angiosperms. We have covered all of these lineages in plants, and we are currently looking at seed plants, in particular gymnosperms. In next class, we're going to dive into angiosperms. So, but before doing that, please think about all of these questions and try to test your knowledge to see if you know which plants or what group has the following structures. For example, what plants have xylem? Then if you are learning in this class, you will probably realize that seedless vascular plants and seed plants have xylem. Bryophytes do not have xylem. This was the class for today. I hope that you have enjoyed it. This is not a commercial, but I want to mention that pines, for example, are very important for many reasons. We get a lot of the woods from pine trees. This is a chemical, a multi-purpose cleaner that it's made out of pine oil, and it smells really good. I really like this smell. This smell is coming from terpenes that these plants produce, and they are very aromatic. So these molecules have been used in aromatherapy. And they also, the pine oil has some properties that are antimicrobial, and that helps keeping your house clean. Okay, well, I hope that you learned something today. Let's continue with the class learning about angiosperms now. Thank you.